Okay, right. We need to get his head round this, right? Let's just get his head round this. So, we've got these laws, right? The European Convention of Human Rights. And it's meant to protect certain rights and freedoms of itself, right? The Act is meant to protect the rights and freedoms. Now, the thing is that if you end up in court and there's a particular law, another law, right? Another act, another law, which goes against those rights, which are a law, you can have it challenged. Like the judge complains to Parliament, right, and gets the law challenged, like to suggest that the government should change the law, right? But the Human Rights Act is law, right? Now, this is the mind. There is a bit of a mind bender on this, right? So you need to end up in court to challenge any law that's been brought against you, that law is against the European Convention of Human Rights, and you can get the judge to complain to Parliament to get that law changed, right? Now, this is the thing, right? So they're bringing in this paper mile, or they want to bring in this paper mile. Now, you can say that that's infringing into your privacy, your private comings and goings, right? Your private daily activities. And if they did that, then that law would be violating the human rights articles. You could also end up in court where old laws that are still in effect might be breaking those human rights, but there are so many laws, there are so many thousands of laws that the government can't check them all, and if it arises that it's against the human rights, then it can be challenged. Now, the only problem is that on that basis, but the government are making new laws that go against that Human Rights Act, like lots of violations on the right to life, like assisted suicide and all these abortion laws. They're also like making laws that go against freedom of expression and speech, right? So mainly more recently, mainly this Labour government and the more recent governments, which means that they don't really care about those human rights articles. And if you have the model of China, you know, this whole social point system and everything, all of the framework that the Chinese government have got in place now, it's all against those human rights articles from what the government are doing, right? Now, this is the thing. Do the government believe that those rights actually, the government, you know, is somehow exempt? Like, the government can break all of those rights because it's the government and it's only there to protect our privacy, our expression from other citizens. But they've also set it up so businesses invade those rights, okay? And it's primarily the businesses that started invading those rights, like with social media platforms getting data on us or getting us to accept submit consent. And like the supermarkets, which Big Brother Watch are investigating these supermarkets, right? Now, this is the thing. There isn't any legislation in effect. Big Brother Watch did a video recently, and they're saying, well, you know, what laws? They're saying that they're trying to make out they haven't made any laws, right? So you can't have any laws in the court to challenge because there aren't any about the social media companies, right? Or the supermarkets surveillance. But there is, right? It's not like, you know, oh, they're doing a new act of law which goes against the Human Rights Convention, so we should challenge it. So this is the thing. It's the actual Human Rights Act itself, the rights which these companies are breaking. It's the companies which are breaking the rights. Okay, now in the criminal procedure rules, you can actually challenge the law going against the rights, okay? Other acts of law are violating these rights, so they need to be changed or shouldn't even be made. But what we're talking about is it's not even law or other acts which go against the violation of the human rights. We're talking about the actual businesses, activities and companies, and like these supermarkets, right? And social media platforms. But if there isn't any legislation governing them, what governs them? Well, the Human Rights Act 1998 governs them, doesn't it? The Human Rights Act 1998 governs what people can and can't do, right? You don't need any other acts. It's if the other acts actually go against those human rights. And I think that Big Brother Watch are missing out on that, because when they did the interview, when they were doing, like, they had one of their girls on there, right? And she was speaking to this guy about, they weren't putting legislation about facial recognition or using the digital surveillance or like social media platforms. But there is laws. It is the Human Rights Act 1998, right? That Article 8 protects your privacy. And those social media platforms are invading the right to privacy, so they're actually breaking the law. But the problem is they're getting you to consent to accept. So you're kind of like agreeing to let them know your personal business, right? But if you don't agree, you can't use the platforms. They're forcing you to agree, but not through any laws. It's a contractual agreement, but this is the thing. How they've done this, right? How they've brought this in. What popular social media platforms, which the whole country are on, are originated in England or are based in England, other than having like a small office in England? None. They're all American or Chinese, like TikTok, right? They don't have European Convention of Human Rights. If those platforms were started in England, originated from England, like TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, right? We could have challenged them, but they're coming from other countries. And those countries which they started in and originated in didn't control what they can and can't do, because they don't have the Human Rights Convention on privacy, right? So they're coming in from overseas and invading us and getting us to consent through a policy. And then if you say, well, the government aren't legislating against it, the government aren't legislating for rules for platforms, the government aren't legislating for rules for surveillance, cameras, well, they are, because that's what the Human Rights Act is a law. It is a law which legislates against it. Says that you can't have your rights infringed on, you've got the right to privacy. Well, if the only main platforms which the most of the nation are going on, all 60 million people or whatever, the only ones that are really on offer and which the government are advertising on their websites, use X, Blue Sky, Facebook, Twitter, right? Then they've coerced everyone in the country to consent to accept and give up their personal private data. So who's got the right to privacy? If every single platform, all the main platforms which are American, by the time they finish, they've got every single person who uses them, which amounts to the most of the country, to give up that right, then how have you got that right anymore? Because they've got everyone in the country to give it up. So no one in the country has a right to the privacy of their social things, because look, these massive, huge, big corporate entities have got the data on it, right? So, and the government are advertising those websites and encouraging you to use them because they advertise and promote them on their contact pages, right? Like they use them. The government, the MPs use them. So they're actually, the government are, you don't say that the government aren't legislated against, these platforms. So we have got the Human Rights Act 1998. We have got it. Article 8. If we didn't have it, we wouldn't have it. We've got it. They don't have it in America. That's where these platforms start and come from. They don't have it in China. That's where TikTok comes from, right? So you need to get your head around this. We have got law which protects the right to privacy. It is the Human Rights Act 1998, ECHR. You don't need any other laws because those articles are meant to protect it, and then you go into court and you say, look, these platforms are coercing and manipulating, forcing us to give up those rights in England, right? And you could say Europe. I don't actually know why they haven't challenged it in Europe. They did challenge some of it on certain things on advertisements on Instagram, but I don't know why the Europeans haven't done this. You know, for this global agenda to work, for this international one world government of Bill Gates and Tony Blair and, Starmer, you can't have those human rights conventions, right? You can't have them because you don't have any right to privacy, because by the time you're finished, all the businesses have invaded your private rights, and then they're only trying to make out that other fellow citizens don't have the right to know your personal business, right? But they're trying to make out that companies are exempt from it, that, like somehow you can trust these companies and it's perfectly all right for them to know everything about you. But actually, the Article 8 of that Human Rights Act 1988, it doesn't distinguish between a company or a business, a private company or a business, or private citizens, does it, right? It doesn't distinguish between them at all. It's like anyone, but also the government. Just because a government's a government, the government are not exempt from prying into your business. What they're trying to do is they're trying to make legislation. They're trying to put legislation through to make out that they need to do it, or they can do it, or that they should do it, right? But this is the thing. That's legislation. So in order for Rachel Reeves to pay per mile and to find out how far you've been driving or where you've been driving to, right? They need to make an act of law which allows them to gather information on that and do it. But to make that act of law is against the Human Rights, European Convention on Human Rights, okay? To make that law, right? That's one example. They've also made a lot of these laws against the right to life. Okay, the actual laws can be challenged. They not just say that companies doing something illegal, or Marks and Spencers are using surveillance and it's against your privacy, or whatever. The actual government itself. This is the thing. The European Convention on Human Rights articles can actually, when you're in a criminal proceeding and you get prosecuted, or you're answering to not following the law, the criminal procedure rules say that the judge can challenge the government with the law that they've made doesn't comply with the act. Not just like Marks and Spencers with the facial recognition, or, Facebook or YouTube looking at all our data on our phones, or seeing our personal business, right? It's actually the government itself have put law through which invades on those rights, which actually means that if the government give themselves powers to spy into our business, you can actually say, oh, no, the government can't do that because it's against the human rights, because it's the act of law which, the government are trying to... What the government are trying to do is trying to make our personal private business their business when it's not. Now, I know, like, for example... the government need to know things about us, or they can't govern us, right? Because we've got, like, Companies House. So if you've got companies, this is what they've just done with Companies House, because Companies House is about businesses. Now, you can't have a business, right, until you register with government. Now, really need to get your head around this, right? Well, you can have a very small business, right? But what I'm saying is, like, like a limited company or a registered company, you can't have a company unless you register it with the government, okay? You can actually do business or do a small business and do it under a certain threshold and not have to pay certain taxes if you do a small business and don't go too big, right? So if it's actually only a very small business, there are certain things you don't have to tell the government to do with taxes and things like that, right? Now, the thing is with the government at the moment, if you've got a business, right? If you've got a business, right, you file things with the government because it's regulated, right? It's regulated. There are regulations. It's regulatory, right? So you file your accounts with the government and taxes and all these other things, right? So But that's not your personal business, like in Article 8 is your private, personal, family life. That's your business. Your business life and your private life are separate, right? So the government, if you've got a big business, the government needs to regulate it, the regulations. But your social life is not regulated by the government, right? You're not meant to have, you're not supposed to regulate who your friends are, or regulate, who you hang around with, or regulate what clubs that you join, or regulate this or that. But they're wanting to do that. That's what China is now. So China is regulating social life, social order. Now, this is the thing with this social media. Now, there's no laws in England, sort of, that, there is. The thing is, there is. Look, these social media platforms, right, they've set up in America, and they've got laws in America. We aren't in America. When we're in England, you follow English law. Now, there's not really any proper English law to regulate your social activities, but what's happening is that the social media platforms are applying these policies which enable them and your fellow citizens to regulate your social life by blocking, banning, or including or excluding you, right? And the if you openly give up your private life and information, like, create a Facebook profile, which is what the BBC told everyone to do, go on Facebook and create a profile. They told everyone to do that. You're putting your private life out there voluntarily, right? But you've got a right to privacy of things that you don't want on there, okay? Now, what the government actually want to do is they want, like, normal social life to be like Companies House, right? So it's regulated. But that's none of their business, because in Article 8, you haven't got a private life, okay? It's like the government saying, who are all your friends? Well, that's none of your business. I don't have to tell you who all my friends are, right? But this is where they're wanting to go with it. Now, this is why they've just converted this Companies House to one government, okay? And they're bringing in the social media platforms because they've got all the MPs on them. And then they've got all their MP contacts they've got on their pages. But guess what? All those MP pages were used for elections, and all the election materials up there still having an influence 365 days a year, ready for the next election. And they didn't take it down 14 days after the election. And it's still having an influence, and also advertising the party when there's other council, local and by-elections going on, right? And they've declared those pages for their MP use for Parliament, right? But Parliament can't promote or advertise an election or a party, but it is doing, because they've said that that's my contact page as an MP, right? So all of the MPs, not every single one of them, but when I say all of them, I'm saying like most of them, right? A majority of them, right? They are using social media illegally, right? They're breaking election law, right? Now, Parliament law is privileged, but they're breaking the election law, okay? That's for sure. And they can be held to account in Parliament for it, because you can, if it doesn't challenge your seat. The Speaker's got the Speaker's Conference for fair elections. Lindsay Hoyle is like, there was a crooked man who walked a crooked mile. He had a crooked sixpence, and upon a crooked stile, he had a crooked cat, and it caught a crooked mouse, and they all lived together in a little crooked house. Lindsay Hoyle's like, he's like, 1 minute he's doing this, like, super serious, squinted eyes, looking left and right, like clever man, like the Mad Hatter. And then the next minute he's like, all right, like potato, Mr. Potato, like lifting his head up in the air and lifting his hand up at the same time, like this, like he's like Lancashire, thick Lancashire lad, like thick Lancashire lad, Emmerdale farm, sheep, like. And then he's switching between these two characters. He's like, hey up, thick, hey up, lad, thick. And then he's like, mastermind, like, squinted eyes left and right, in Parliament, sharp, super sharp, he fucking knows everything. He's got the fucking, eats the manual for fucking breakfast. Might as well eat that Erskine May book, because that Erskine May book's not even the law, it's the advice of a clerk, which is not the law, right? It ain't standing orders either. So, you might as well fry it and cook it up and eat it, that Erskine May book, right? Because standing orders are the law of Parliament, right? And they can vote to suspend those rules, by the way. By the way, they can have it so there is no law of Parliament, but unless they actually officially vote to suspend the rules, then, this is the thing, there's meant to be standing orders. You're meant to have some sort of structure to it, right? So, Lindsay Hoyle's meant to, it's a speakers conference. I've got the speakers conference, we've got a fair elections. Bollocks! Since 2005, 6, 7, 8, the election, it's absolutely and completely corrupt, and the Electoral Commission are not helping at all with it. In fact, these agencies are all under this administrative think tank law, which basically prevents them from doing anything because they, you want to just be able to go and get a solicitor or a lawyer and prosecute them if they do something wrong, not some of these complaints that, nothing gets done with them, just like assess them. So, the social media, what was the point in that last little bit there that I said? The social media is the sneaking in of this governance over social order and activity, popularity and so forth. Now, you need popularity for elections, right? And this is how they're doing it. They've snuck this they've got us onto the social media to create all the digital identity and information and get us to voluntarily give it up, right? But actually, it's illegal to do that since 1998 because we've got a right to. If it's not possible to use a platform without consenting to give up your privacy to these big corporate entities like Facebook, YouTube, Google, then you don't have that right because they are making you give up that right to them, okay? Now, that means that, you might not let other fellow private citizens know your business, but these big companies are going to know it all or be able to know it all, right? But ultimately, that's what the government wanted to know, and that's why they're incorporating it into the government. Meanwhile, they're merging this company's house into this one government thing, which is kind of like connecting the social media contact of the MPs, which they're getting everyone to use and sign up to it and use it, and they're gradually removing their postal address or their telephone contact. Reform UK don't have any telephone contact on Parliament. So unless you write to them in the post, and now Royal Mail's been sold out and it costs a fortune, right, to post letters, although petitions are going to be free to Parliament. But if you don't have any postal contact for MPs and they didn't have a phone number, right, and the emails at parliament.gov.uk, but let's say that this is just a little tweak and an example to show you, right? If Parliament remove email contact from all the MPs' pages so there isn't any, right, and the Reform MPs don't have a telephone number, right, and let's say that Royal Mail put their prices up, so you couldn't afford to send a letter to an MP because it's meant to be free to send a petition, but when you write to your MP, is that a petition or not? That's another argument or debate. You would, in theory, what potentially a very few minor tweaks now, right, on the MP's contact, right, and you would only have social media to contact them through, right? Now, whether it's Messenger or leaving a message on their page or whatever, they could reply to your Messenger just like it was an email, right? But then all of the Parliament contact is suddenly through these social media platforms, right? Can you understand that? If they did that, you'll be using that social media to contact your MPs, right? And therefore, contact with MPs would also be under these social media policies, right? Now, this is the thing. When they're doing that, then everyone in the country is going to have to go on the social media in order to contact their MP, and then you've got to agree to the policies, which is submit, consent, accept, and you're giving up your right to privacy, right, to these big companies. So, but you haven't got any option. If you have to do something, there's no alternative to do it, you don't have a legal right anymore. And this is what Starmer's trying to sell, is unless you have digital ID, you won't have a right to work unless you have digital ID. So when you're born and you come out of a womb, you don't have any rights, okay? You don't even have a right to exist, right? Until you had a digital identity created. Like the birth certificate is kind of different because I don't actually think you need a birth certificate, like, to work. Like, like when I give that example, when if you've got a very small business and it's very tiny, you don't have to register with government or tax. Theoretically, you could work, right? Because you could, like, clean someone's drive or, do a car wash or something for like £5 or whatever, right? You don't need a birth certificate for that. So what Starmer's trying to make out is that you don't have a right to life or to live unless you submit consent and accept. Now, when you're in a country, there are laws there, right? The laws exist under the governance of that government, okay? So as you pass into another country, okay, this is why we've got passports, right? Because when you're in another country, they want to know who you are. But the passport's not a birth certificate, but you give your birth certificate to your own country in order to get the passport, right? But if you're in, Iran or Australia or Fiji or wherever, right, if their police or government pull you over, then you get your passport out. But that's not your birth certificate, right? But you had a birth certificate in your original country to get the passport, right? But it's not like, now, if you're in that country, what if you lose your passport? Well, you can still go like buy a kind of pop, or you can still get in a bus or whatever using money, right? And if you were in that country, you can live, or at least live for a few months or a year. This is what happens to people when they don't get visas. You could go to America and just live there, right? And if you lost your passport, so what? You could work in a fucking petrol station in the middle of Route 66 or something, right? But obviously, after you've been there so long, right, then it expires. And then what they do is they throw you out of the country, right? If you've been there too long. This is what happens to some people who move to America and, don't go through the proper processes to become American citizens. But you've still got a right to be alive. Look, how about all those people who come over the American border, right? They were throwing them out, and then Trump's kicking off about building a wall, right? And yet they don't kill you, though. They don't, like, execute you. They don't line you up to the gas chambers like Hitler. They don't put you give you a lethal injection. They don't put you in an electric chair. In fact, they were giving some people free flights out of the country, right? They deport you. So you've still got the right to life, to be alive. Now, if you're in England, okay, and if you don't get this digital ID, Starmer is saying that, okay, you might have a right to be alive, okay, but what happens if you're in England, right? You haven't got a passport, you haven't got a driving licence, and if you didn't get Starmer's digital ID, but what happens if you lose your birth certificate? Who the fuck are you, right? The government want to know who you are. But, if you don't have any of those things, are they going to kill you? Are they going to execute you? Are they going to put you in gas chambers? If you do not have anything on you, is Starmer going to kill you? Is he going to? He can't. Maybe he can deport you if you can't prove that you were born in England. So that's what you need the birth certificate for. But note that if you didn't have a birth certificate to prove that you were English, then would Starmer say, well, I will deport you because you can't prove that you're English, so I'll deport you, but he can't kill you, right? But, they're starting to go that way with assisted suicide. If he can get you before he comes out of the womb, once you've popped out of the womb, he can't kill you, but, if you're in the process of being made, now he can kill you, apparently, right? Or if you are at any age, phase, or state of life and you don't want to live anymore, apparently now you can ask your judge's permission to end your life, right? But this is the thing, right? He's saying that you can't have a very tiny small business, and not have any big aspirations and just, be a surfer or work in, real on the fucking beach building sandcastles and work in a little cafe, or like one day a week, just to go to, pick strawberries or Mark and Spencer's or something, right? And just chill, right? And you're not that bothered about having many things, right? Apparently, Simon doesn't even want you to do that, so you won't have any money. But this is the thing: if you don't have any money, right? Now, this is I've kind of gone off subject, but I'm going to carry on now because we're getting into Starmer, the barrister, the genius barrister that Starmer is, right? You know, he came out of university in the 80s, and apparently he's a Human Rights Act. This is his specialist subject, right? Human rights. So the Human Rights Act 1998, although Starmer came out, you know, in the mid late 80s, right, of university, but he's going to be a human rights lawyer. So the Human Rights Act is Starmer's thing, but as Prime Minister now, he's breaking every fucking thing in the Act, right? This government, in fact, his mission with Tony Blair is to completely and totally obliterate those rights, because apparently the government, they don't apply to the government, right? Well, if they don't apply to the government, how is it that a judge can say the government isn't allowed to make an act or the act's incompatible with the right, okay? Because the government can only do something if it makes it into law, okay? And apparently you can challenge it in a court. You can challenge the law, right? Because that's what the human rights in the criminal procedure rules, you can say that, you know, that law goes against the right. So if you can challenge that law goes against the right, then you can challenge the MPs making the law and giving themselves the powers, right? Which is a good thing about that act. Now, this is the thing. If you can't work, right, you can't eat, and you can't rent anywhere to stay because you can't pay for it. So either you sat on the beach at Rhyl, right, and this is actually what's just popped into my head now is that story in Scotland last month, right? They had these African people who had fled from America, entertainers, and they were just living in Scotland in the wild, but it was council land, and the council booted them off. You know, you got to be able to. This is the whole thing to do with the government wanting to get rid of gypsies and people who live on the land, because as long as you can live on the land somewhere in England, like gypsy travellers, this is why. But yet, what they do is they get people like Suella Braverman and Priti Patel to dislike them because they're proper English, you know, deep-rooted English people, part of the land. You know, they grow out of the floor like seeds and flowers, right? They're just there. This is why the government hated them, because, you know, there was little regulatory requirements of them, right? And they don't like those sort of people. So that's all clear and obvious now, how they had to destroy and get rid of all the traveller type people, right? But they used foreign MPs like Priti Patel and Suella Braverman to have a reason to kind of like not like them. Even though I suppose, like, you know, if you go to Stonehenge, I'm not saying that there aren't plenty Asian females who are, you know, like kind of like, you know, wear sort of hippie clothes or bohemians and are like, you know, walk around, you know, with like peace and love signs or whatever, you know. But, you know, particularly, you know, Suella Braverman and, you know, Priti Patel, you know, affluent, successful businesswomen are, you know, particularly both being Asian, are not particularly, they're a little, you know, there's some distastefulness about the whole ideology of people living off the land, you know, particularly I think it's the fact that ethnically, you know, like when you fill a police form in, if you got all these police forms, you know, are you English, Irish, gypsy traveller, all this type of stuff, you're getting into that kind of area. And it's like, the thing is, those type of people, even though they're poor, they've got no money, they don't have any big business aspirations, they might not be well educated, as we talk about education. But there's one thing that they have got. They're as white as fucking white can be, if not fucking ginger, right? And, you know, they got the freckles to show it. So, you know, you can strip them of the clothes, you can strip them of the fucking... You can strip them of everything, you know, except a leaf, right? Or even take that off them. But, you know, if they're walking around, you know, with an Irish accent, unless they're a very good actor, you don't get a strong Irish accent unless you've usually grown up or been to school, or even if not been to school, but you don't acquire that characteristic as part of your manifestation of your embodiment unless you're a very, very good actor and you can put on absolute perfect impersonation of any accent possible, right? You don't get that unless you're the genuine article, the real thing. So I think that the thing with those people is they're extremely native. They're deeply they've got very strong claims to nativeness, right? Even if they don't have a fucking passport, because they're the embodiment of it, right? So that's probably why there could possibly be a little bit of Priti Patel and Sullah Braverman type people who are very posh but of, different ethnicity that is not originally from this country, why they might not rub off quite well with gypsy traveller type people from British Isles, who the government wanted to eradicate them, basically. That's what they've been trying to do. It definitely doesn't go with this digital identity plan at all, right? But yet we've got ancient customs, in our constitution. We've got the right to our ancient customs, ancient customs like trade. The right to use money is one of the ancient customs. I can't see, you see all these companies like Starbucks is a foreign company. It's a foreign company, Starbucks. It buys businesses in England, and then suddenly, in its business practices, it suddenly says, we're not going to accept money anymore. But they're in a country where there's the constitutional right to ancient customs, which is trade. So I'll swap you a chicken for a piece of bread, or I'll swap you, a car for a boat, or whatever. That's trading something. You got to understand what the word trade means, okay? It means to swap something, exchange something, right? And to diminish or remove what trade actually means is to go against the Constitution, So if Starbucks will not swap you for something, will only accept this or that, it's not free trade. And this is why they wanted to use the word fair trade. They did this big foreign thing on fair trade, right? Which Tony Blair, I think, had a lot to do with that, fair trade. But the thing is, what's free trade? Free trade means that you don't have to use money to buy something. Freedom, free trade means that I'm free to trade anything that I've got with you, right? So, if I've got, a Frank Sidebottom head, which I've just made, I could trade it with you for your shoes, right? That's free, the freedom to trade. And if they're both worth the same value, it's like an exchange, a swap, right? And, there might not be any profit made on that, it could be not for profit, just free swap. But, there's something, what Starbucks are actually doing, they're not allowed to set up in this country and not accept money. And no one's gone to court and challenged it. Just like, they haven't challenged the social media platforms for taking away all our right to privacy. Give it up. And then you've got, the government are trying to put these laws through to make it compulsory. Well, the platforms have made it compulsory when it's not the law. In fact, the law says they can't do it. So these platforms have come over, and in order for us to engage with them, they have, what they've done is they have made us accept and consent to their policies, which aren't law, but those policies can't be legal. And by the time we've finished, we haven't got any rights left in this country. So they're actually acting illegally. But because we agreed to it and we've allowed them to do it, then the government now, and this is kind of like where we are with the government part of it now. This is the whole point of the argument. Because all these big social media platforms have got us to voluntarily give up our privacy and a lot of those European rights voluntarily, which they can't actually do. It's illegal. By the time they've done it to the whole country, then the whole country doesn't have that right anymore. So you can't. If you have a whole country voluntarily give up a right, how do you have it anymore? Now the government are going a step further than the social media companies, because now they've duped us into letting us believe that what Facebook and YouTube done was legal, right? And because leading us to believe that, these Starbucks companies can, stop accepting cash when they're in a country where there's a legal requirement to accept it, in the Constitution, there actually is, right? The government now is saying, actually, now we've got all these people we've led them to believe that all these things are lawful and they can be done to these people, which they can't. Then the government say, right, well, we're going to actually start legislating these type of things now. Like, you've got to have a digital ID, and we want to know everywhere you're going, because, you let the platforms know where you're going because you submitted consent and accepted to the GPS data following you. So Mark Zuckerberg and Sergey Brin and Google and, Elon Musk, you allowed them to know all your private details, right? In fact, by the time the government have finished with all this, if the government closed their email down and stopped using telephone, which is what the the courts, the Ministry of Justice have withdrawn telephone communication. They say they're not going to telephone you anymore, right? And they're not accepting a postal address. They don't want to post anything to you. So they're saying that if you have not got an email address, you can't complain or contact them. That means that if you haven't got a computer, you can't contact them. Right? So what happens if a policeman prosecutes you? You haven't got a computer. He knows where you live because he writes it down on a bit of paper and he comes down to your house, right? And if he needs you in court, and don't turn up at the court, then they send a policeman around to come and get you from your house, right? But yet judicial conduct is saying you can't complain about that unless you have an email address. But if you can get prosecuted, right? If you are prosecutable without an email address, which you are, then you can complain about it without an email address. Now the judicial conduct are withdrawing from that, so the Ministry of Justice. So the Ministry of Justice are forcing you to have an email. Now, all they need to do, the next step on this is how the next step goes, right? The next step is this. So, like, if all the government has to do now, it's got all the contact pages of the MPs, mostly on social media. All the government has to do is say, well, we're not using electronic email anymore, and we're only actually using social media. Now, so therefore, you would have to be using these big social media platforms to contact the government through and engage with the government, possibly even judicial conduct, and then they're immediately on all of your social interactions, and they're not private anymore. And this is where the police and government can do whatever they want to and just look at it because you give it up to, and then because you voluntarily give it up to the platforms, and then the government you're not going to voluntarily give it up to the government because they're going to enact this law to make it a compulsory requirement. But we decide what the laws are. We elect MPs, and you give instructions and directions to your MP to tell him what to do in Parliament. Right? But he's doing what Tony Blair, Keir Starmer and a political party want, which is Labour. It's a group, an organisation, an entity. Now, this is the thing. If you can't vote for an entity. If Keir Starmer, right, has a, mysterious disease or something and dies, right, RIP, you can't vote for him. So he can't stand for Labour. So you haven't voted for a party because if any MP ceases to exist, they're not representing that party or anyone. You can't vote for a party, right? You cannot vote for a party because without a person, you cannot go into a polling station and vote for Labour because Labour's not a human, right? And they're not a candidate. And this is what they started to do with the London Assembly. You got these votes and they're starting to get you to vote for party or Labour and not the person, which is what they want you to do. Vote for the company, vote for the organisation. The person you vote for is meant to represent your interests and the interests of everyone else, which always is based on a majority for whatever matter it is. And the majority always overrides any other interests of, party or whatever. I think that what the Labour and the Tories and Reform are doing is illegal anyway. It's kind of like it is corporate capture. There's no other word for it. But so now, when the government are putting these laws through, they're against the European Convention of Human Rights anyway. They're against those articles, okay? Now, it's not a case of, YouTube, Facebook and X and Blue Sky and Twitter are all violating these articles. Yes, you can go into court but you need to get a lawyer in the High Court or do it yourself, or if you get prosecuted and it touches on those processes, you can get called out in the court, right? But it's going to be difficult to get YouTube or Facebook in the court over their policy when it's like they are the vehicle. It's like they're the vehicle. If you're in a car and you have a scrap or a fight or something with someone or an incident, it's against that person, not against the vehicle, right? So it's difficult to get Facebook and YouTube in the court and challenge their policies through their criminal procedure rules, because they're the vehicle, not the person who you're bringing the charge against, right? But I mean, and you've already given up your right to privacy from the policy, okay? And the police have got the right to make certain inquiries, but apparently the platforms aren't being that cooperative with the police, supposedly. But you don't actually need to. You see, you can challenge. If you're going to the High Court, you can go into the High Court tomorrow if you've got enough money or if you're competent yourself, and you could just say Starbucks is breaking the English Constitution. Starbucks is not free trade, and it's going against our ancient customs of this country. It's illegal, right? Because they're not accepting open free trade, right? And you've got a legal requirement to do that in this country, okay? Because it's our customs. They're trying to. They're a foreign business company moving into this country with their own. You could say, well, they're bringing in their own customs, which are we don't use money. If you come into this country with your own customs, and the custom of my people is not to use cash because we're big corporate entity people, we take cards. We say, well, you come into my country, we welcome you in. You have to come to our customs, right? And this is what the big corporate companies have created their own customary behaviour, their own nation and world, really, and they're trying to take over ours and take it from us. That's what's going on. But they can't, legally, they can't do it. And this is what that Matt Kennard was investigating, all these big private companies suing the government if the government made a law that put them out of profit, which that to me is wrong. There's something wrong about that process. It can't be right. I mean, because there's some violation of parliamentary privilege there. I mean, you can't use privileges for protections against civil suits, but you've got a right to make and change law, which everyone complies with. You know, why aren't we, suing the government? This is the thing. We don't have all the money, and we're not getting the right arguments in there. We're not getting the right people who go into court with the right ideas and attitude. What should be happening is groups like the Good Law Project, and Joel and Morgan, who can go into a high court and put a case across, right, for people, should be saying, Starbucks is against the ancient customs of England. But Joel and Morgan's not really that interested in that. Maybe he's on the side of the corporate takeover. I don't know. But he's got his own interest. This is the thing. I don't know how he can run a charity, which is a good law project, if you just only do cases on your own personal interests, like, gender and sexuality. It just doesn't seem right to me. Joel and Morgan could go into the High Court, right, tomorrow, next week, whatever, next month, and say, firstly, Starbucks, he has to comply with our ancient customs in this country. It's law. But he's not that up on constitutional law. Graham Moore is. if Graham Moore worked with Joel and Morgan, they could prove that in a court. They could also prove that what Facebook, YouTube, and all these big social media companies have done is coerced and deceived the country into giving up their right to privacy, which is against Article 8 of the Human Rights Act, okay? And they've done it to the whole nation, the entire nation. So it's like, if that ain't serious, I don't know what is, Every single person who's using one of these social media platforms, they've got them to give up their personal privacy to big corporate entities. So you don't have any privacy from the corporate sector, right? They can't do that. That's against the European Convention of Human Rights. And then you've got then you've got the other thing that's been done to us. Besides that, is like this fish. All right, so now we get onto the Big Brother Watch. I started recording this because of Big Brother Watch, right? It was because of Big Brother Watch, okay? So, Big Brother Watch, their main priority and concern is this facial recognition technology software, which is mainly being used by the authorities, police, and private corporate entities, right? Now, So that's another thing. Gerald Morgan could, for the Good Law Project, Gerald Morgan, if he wanted to, he could go into court, tomorrow, next week, next month, whatever, and say that this is against our right to privacy, what these supermarkets are doing. The supermarkets, now, this is the thing. When you're walking around the supermarket, right, when you buy things, the shop knows what you've bought because it's just, the shop knows what you've bought because you bought it from them and they've got the receipt, right? And they don't want you to steal or take anything from the shop, right? But there are certain things and activities when you're in the shop that aren't any of the shop's business, right? Like, if you've got, a mole on your shoulder, which you're covering it up, right? But this is the thing with all these, this stupid COVID virus, health and safety. It's why they triggered that and did it, okay? But normally, you wouldn't have to tell the shop if you've got, a swollen boil on your arm, which was painful. That's your own private business, right? It's your own private personal medical business between you and your doctor, right? You don't have to tell the shop that. But if they're filming all these things, and examining you on cameras or whatever, that's getting into your personal private business. Or if you've been to another shop, right? If you've been to a different shop and you go into that store, right? They don't have any right to ask you what you bought from the other shop, right? Okay. And then also your private conversation. If you're in the shop and you're talking to your friend about what you're doing. When you go out later, that's personal private. Now, on eBay, they're saying, don't talk about this or that, They're trying to say you're not allowed to say certain things when you're using their service, right, or talk to other people. Now, if you were in the shop and you were talking to your friend and then the staff come up to you and say, stop talking to your friend, or you're not allowed to talk about what you bought in the other shop, it's like you wouldn't be able to have a conversation in there. So you've got your own personal business and private lives, but then also if they're videoing and recording conversations, then they're like listening into your conversations, what you did with your friend. How do they even know? This is another thing on eBay, right? If you're speaking to a seller on eBay, how does eBay even know what you're talking about? Like, to say that because the policy, they got you to agree to the policy. Now you might say, well, look, if I'm having a private conversation with another seller, that's none of your business. We say, well, it is our business because you agreed to our policy and we can look at what you're saying, right? But that's private. So, look, the way they're going with this, right, you can't have a right to privacy by the time they're finished. When these big corporate companies are running most services, you're not left with a right to privacy. And when the government have finished giving themselves what we've been voluntarily consenting to these companies. So Keir Starmer, he cannot believe in that Human Rights Act, but he's a human rights lawyer. You can't have that act, and you can't have those articles. They can't exist with what he wants the world governance to be, which means that at some point when he was a human rights lawyer and he was acting to use that act, he doesn't believe in it, like it, or want it, or he thinks that it should be scrapped. Now, there's one distinction between, we're the government, and because we make things in law, we can do what the hell we want. So none of those human articles apply to us. They don't affect the government. And by the time what they're doing now is finished, they cannot apply to private corporate businesses because private corporate businesses get to consent, submit and give away all those rights. So you're only left with them applying to fellow citizens, private persons. The Human Rights Act 1998 does not say that you only have a right to privacy from other citizens. It says you've got a right to privacy, right? So that includes whether they're citizens, whether they're companies or businesses, or whether it's the government, other persons. Now, none of these big companies or businesses are complying with that Human Rights Act 1998 because the policies that they're putting across are violating it in Europe, in England, not in America, not in China, not in Australia, not in Russia, not on the fucking moon, in Europe and England, which we've got that act. And all these American companies are breaking that law. And the Chinese ones now, it's an illegal criminal, right? Now, that needs to be proved in a court, including all of the cameras, facial recognition, the fucking lot, all of it. Now, you say, oh, the police haven't got any law and regulations on the surveillance. They have! It's invading your privacy, right? It is invading your privacy. With the police, if you commit a crime, they're allowed to question you and investigate. But if you haven't, if you have not committed a crime, right, and you are not suspected of a crime, the police don't have any rights or interest to observe or ask you questions about anything, unless it's terrorism, right, and you've got to answer questions. Now, this is another thing. So you're innocent. How they're wanting to do it is that the police have got a right to observe, surveil, and do anything if you're innocent, just in case you might or could do. So it basically means that they want to spy on you. They want every single person. They want to know everything they're doing, what they're planning, and who their friends are. If they're innocent. So therefore, when you've finished with that, you don't have a right to privacy. An innocent person doesn't have a right to privacy because they might not be innocent or whatever. So it can't work. Now, there are loads of legal arguments around this, very complicated ones, right? But I don't think that they ever intended those articles ever to keep them. They've made them quite vague, like everyone has the right to freedom of expression. If you're going to make that law, stand by it, right? If you're going to go to the effort to enact that law seriously and not be joking or taking the piss, right? Not doing it for comedy value. If you're going to go into a government which runs a country and vote and prepare the act and put it through, and it's a big thing in Europe as well, then stand by it. Either you believe in it or you don't. If you don't believe that every single other human has the right to express themselves completely freely, like when they're happy, sad, angry, what pissed off, like, fuck you, twat, right, whatever, then why did you put the act through? And if you don't believe that person has a freedom of speech and the right to privacy, now looking at this plan, which we know they've been strategizing and planning it for a long time, which has become clear now, they can't ever have wanted those rights to apply. I think that looking at those rights are all the things that would obstruct or get in the way of this, because if you're going to have this freedom of privacy, you've got so many conflicts of interest and contradictions with the police aspect of it. If you're going to say, well, the police are going to end up with the right to surveil anyone, even if they're completely innocent, all the time, then you haven't got any right to privacy from the police. You haven't got any right to privacy from the government looking at your bank account. And you haven't got any right to privacy from the companies. So unless they meant, when they made this Human Rights Act, unless they meant it only private, normal citizens have the right to privacy from each other, and it doesn't apply to private companies or governments. But it doesn't say that, though, does it? So I think that this is to do with, why did they do this convention in Europe? Why choose Europe? Well, this is why. There's something to do with the Eurovision, and I don't mean the song contest, right? We're talking about like Eurovision, vision. Who can understand and see this, right? Who can, who gets this, right? This global domination won't take over one government of the whole world thing, right? They've already done it to China. They didn't fucking see that coming, did they? And they don't have human rights there. So did China have the European vision to see that coming? Did they fuckers like, right? They don't have it in America. And it's only Europe. Now, in Europe, you have people who would not let that happen, what happened to China. There would be people in Europe who would see this coming, have the vision, the sight to see this coming. The European vision, right, which clearly the fucking Chinese don't have, or wouldn't have ended up fucking as like, digital slaves or whatever. We see it coming now, and we're complaining about it, but a government are bullshitting us and lying to us, right? But we didn't, because we clearly, Eurovision is meant to be like, a sandwich shop of a picnic, right? We didn't clock the American platforms swooping in to Europe, where we're protected from giving up our privacy, and coercing us to give it all up on their platforms. In fact, they don't let you use them, but then they coerce everyone to use it, and the MPs are wanting everyone to use it to contact them now. And the BBC told everyone to go on Facebook and create a digital identity, right? So, but it's illegal in Europe. It is not lawful. It can't be lawful, right? It cannot be lawful in Europe. They started it in America and came in. Where is the English platforms? There aren't any. Why is it Zuckerberg, Musk, Sergey Brin, Russian-American, like Ben and Jerry's, right? In fact, that Sergey Brin and his Ponzi mate, right, who have taken over the internet. We've just got a search engine, we provide a search engine service, type it in and we'll find it for you. We're an index company, right? The next thing, they've sold out to shit adverts, spammed the world. They've spammed planet Earth with crap adverts. They're no use to anyone. And they've made billions out of it. And now Sergey Brin's like the next fucking, genius biology scientist. He's doing protein synthesis and designing humans, and whether people want a male or female baby, whether what nationality do you want your child, you could be a Chinese person and, have sex with a Mongolian and give birth to a fucking Amazonian kid, right? By the time they finish with their genetic research, right? And then gain a function. Just make sure you haven't gained as much function as Google has and take them over, because that would be a function to gain. Hey, gain a function. Hey, now I'm the next genius college graduate, right? Look, I've just had a baby. It's 5-year-old and it's more intelligent than Mark Zuckerberg, and it just set up a business on AI and it's outcompeted Google and it shut it down. And now it's like that cartoon with that little kid. It looks a bit like Frank Sidebottom, that little kid, that little baby who's like, plotting to rule the world. Sergey Brin's just going to make sure that, you don't have as much more gain of function than he has, because then you might put Google out of fucking business, right? When, it's illegal anyway. In my opinion, it's not lawful. This is the thing, So they've conned us, they've swindled us, they've cheated us. The main big platforms have used appeal and distraction, and these MPs now that they've managed to get us to consent and accept it all, which is totally, it's illegal. What they're doing is criminal against the Human Rights Act 1998 for sure, and Marks and Spencer's, all these companies, right, and the police. It's all illegal. What they're doing is now our government are trying to make out that it's legal, it's lawful, and that they're going to make legislation to make it compulsory that we sign up to and comply all these things, right? When actually you can even challenge whether the government can do it or not through like incompatibility. It's all incompatible with the convention rights, all of it. And these new laws they're putting through, they're even putting laws through now which go against those rights. In fact, I think it was a test run. The European Convention on Human Rights is a convention. Convention. A trick, a deception. The word con means convention. It's a trick, right? What they did is, well, all these type of things are going to get in the way of this global master plan, right? So we'll throw them out quite vague, right? And we'll see if we can get things past everyone, right? So what they did is they put the European Convention out and made them extremely fucking vague, like YouTube policy, right? And then they said, right, there's thousands of laws. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of laws. We can't go through them all and check if they're compatible, but if any happens to be compatible with these brilliant rights we've just given you, then you can call it out in court, right? And we'll see how you get on. And I don't think there's been that many. And what's actually happening is they've been checking to see if we have the vision that if we spot check them, right, when these laws have been violated. But they played it all on the government, like, it's legislation. Now, all of the actual violations are being done by policies from foreign countries, bringing their business in here and totally violating us out of our native national, not only our native constitutional law, like the right to a free trade and the customs, the customary traditions of the country, right? They're also conning us out of these human rights as well. And actually by getting you to consent to it, accept that they're doing it. Right? Now, every single thing they're doing is fucking illegal against that Human Rights Act. You don't need to call out the legislation. These companies, they all need to be prosecuted, right, for violating our rights and coercing us to doing it and not giving us any other option. If you're in a country where something is your right, okay, then they've got to give you the option. But they're not giving you option to not consent, submit or agree. You have to. Now, they've got certain settings and this and that, but all the settings are complicated. And people don't really... They've made them ridiculously they're not intuitive. So what Mark Zuckerberg has done, right, I've never, ever once looked through the Facebook menu and known what the fuck I'm looking at, and I am not retarded, I'm not stupid, right? When you used to do it on Windows, you knew where things were. What Mark Zuckerberg's done is done a illogical, non-rational menu system with unfamiliar terminology and words which don't explain clearly what each function is. So you haven't got the fucking foggiest clue what it is, and you need to get someone like, Good Law Project, that girl from Good Law Project, to tell you how to fucking do it, right? And then Mark Zuckerberg, right, he says that you're thick because you don't understand his menu system when he was being a clever twat, a clever GitHub, right? And created these Facebook executive graduate student bullshit terms to make working people feel thick because it's not intuitive or rational menu system. It's as if it's like a fucking science fucking paper terminology, right? So you've got to actually learn it, right? To understand Facebook menu and settings and Google, you've got to learn them, study them, which means and no one wants to do that. When you get a mobile phone, you want to set it up and just fucking use it, right? Because we ain't got time for that. It's meant to be user-friendly. And in fact, the tablets and that, Tim Cook from Apple wants to make everything simple. The Mark Zuckerberg and Google menus are not simple. They're purposely complicated because they don't want you to go through them and actually customize them to stop them accessing everything. And to be honest, even if you I don't think that you can. Even if you turn every single thing off, I still think that they're violating some of those human rights, privacy anyway. And you've got to put like a day or a week to study and learn all those menus and terms to know what they are, right? And most people don't want to or haven't got the time to do that, right? So it's purposely complicated, right? And I just don't think that even if you change all those settings, I don't think that I still think it would be illegal, right? It's just bollocks. So I think they were acting illegally, and also the supermarkets as well, and the police with the facial recognition. It is illegal. It's illegal against the right to privacy. But this is the thing. They're making you argue it. So you go into court and then you say, this is against my right to privacy, right? But then you've got to put the argument and you've got to explain why. Yet the articles are quite simple. They're not like proper codified law. That means that no matter what argument you put or explanation you put, it's going to come down to the judge. And you're not going to have a jury. You're not going to have other Facebook users there. If every single person in the country nearly is on Facebook and YouTube or platforms, that means that your jury is going to be, it's likely that they're going to use those platforms as well, right? So if you say they're violating my human rights, then they're all users of those platforms, and they might say, yeah, they are, right? You ain't going to get that now because they've scrapped juries out the court. So it's going to come down to a high court judge, right? It's going to be a high court judge who decides your argument, whether it's good enough to say that all of this facial recognition is against that privacy thing. And it's going to be the judge's decision, just like life or death now, right to life, And this is what Keir Starmer's skill is. Keir Starmer's entire career is the totality of his skills in life, his talent, his qualifications, everything that Keir Starmer is now is what argument can you put across to convince a judge, not a jury of the people, if these companies are breaking that Human Rights Convention on privacy. And it's going to be the judge who does it. And if you argue that, you can go to the Supreme Court. So it's going to be 3 people from the House of Lords, right? And that means that the people won't decide. The actual peoples whose rights are being taken won't be deciding it. It will be 3 members of the House of Lords ultimately, right? And if Keir Starmer can put the argument. But now, Keir Starmer is arguing that it isn't everything the government is doing, everything these companies are doing, everything the police is doing, the whole lot isn't against the Human Rights Article Convention, right? In fact, Sola Braven wants to scrap those rights. So Keir Starmer is using all of his entire life, the totality, the pinnacle of his entire life, skills as a barrister, as a lawyer now, is to argue that what they're doing is lawful. It doesn't violate our human rights as a government. Yet you can get a judge to say that, it is that the laws he's putting through are against the laws that the government are putting through against human rights, right? Now, this would be okay if you could get a fair argument or trial, but this is the guy who's failed to disclose evidence as a Crown prosecutor, which could undermine his cases in our rights. He's failed to disclose privileges for protesters, which would actually render the Crown prosecutors as criminals in contempt of the Constitution, and he was in charge of them, right? So now he's the Prime Minister. He's already a criminal man. He is a criminal man already. And now he's going to argue the complete opposite side of his entire life but he's not going to argue it because he's only got to debate it with elected MPs, people who stood for an election and got voted and have the right to vote in Parliament, and he only has to convince those people, right? And if they voted through Parliament, apparently, he can do it. Because no matter what complaints that you put through, the government are just going to fucking ignore them, right? Advertising standards, judicial conduct, Solicitors Regulation Authority, Electoral Commission, Boundary Commission, whatever. They're all under administrative think tank policy law. They ain't going to do nothing, right? We've got an e-petition service who refuse our constitutional right of the community to all be present, to write down a grievance and collect signatures from other citizens and hand that into Parliament and have your MP argue that you've got a right to have them argue it, right? They're not allowing you to share it to your other citizens, and they don't want it published on the website if you submit any evidence, claim or facts. That means that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of England, doesn't want his opposition to be able to submit anything. No challenge. Nothing. And he doesn't want anyone to know about it. He's a secret squirrel, right? Talk about the right to privacy. He doesn't want anyone to know the facts that can beat him or tell anyone or even submit the challenge. He doesn't want to be challenged. And all the MPs, including Labour, if they don't do what he says I'll never stand for Labour again and throw him out of the party. So, you couldn't have anyone ever who was as unfair, as deceptive, cheative. He does. If you were fighting this guy on a battlefield, you wouldn't have anything. You'd be naked, and he would have absolutely everything. Talk about Donald Trump wanting to invade Nigeria, right? Starmer wants you to have nothing and not even be able to lift a finger up. He wants you to stand there like when you're in a court and you're in the booth, be strapped down, tied down, gagged, and him just dictate to you what it is and how it's going to fucking be, and have someone decide who's not even the public. And these judges all seem to be in on this Tony Blair, Fabian strategy, right? They can't be in favour of the European Convention of Human Rights, because what the actual European Convention on Human Rights are the same strategy as what Google and Facebook are using, and in the same ideology behind what the government are using, which is that if we make this extremely vague, no one will be able to have anything to get their teeth into on it. There won't be any point you can make or any... Instead of having if you're climbing up the face of a cliff, right, and you've got all these little nooks and crannies and sharp things to grab onto, you got something to grab with your hand, something to bite, right? You got something there to grab hold of, right? The Facebook policy and YouTube is so vague, right, that it's like a glass cliff face. You can't grab hold of anything, right? And it's purely YouTube. You can submit whatever dispute and argument on that form like once, and they'll just fucking reject it automatically, right? And then no matter what you argue with them, it's just nope. They're in a castle in the sky, right? And they're just executing executive functions against us, and that's all by submitting consent and accepting. It's all illegal, right? That is how Starmer wants the government to run and be. And that is how those human rights articles were designed. So if you actually had an argument or something to get hold of, right, you could win. But it's so vague that, this is what it's all up to the judge. So you could have the best argument in the world and he could just say no, right? And this is the thing, which means that you haven't got anything to argue or work with, really, right? Because what the government are going to say is that, we are the government. We have the right to know everyone's private details. The Human Rights Act article is only for scumbags, poor people, citizens, it's for the population, but the big platforms and corporations and companies and Coca-Cola and, companies, businesses, people, we rule. We dominate, we rule. We have the right to know everything. And everyone kneeled to us. Kneel, consent, submit, accept. Yet, it can't be lawful. It can't be legal. And this is what they need to do. This is the Eurovision aspect of it, right? It's like those articles are so vague that they're breaking every single they're breaking all of them. But you can't get your teeth into it because they make them so vague that, we don't have the right freedom of expression, because if you did, you could say what the hell you wanted, but you can't. So it is like a trick or a con, and I don't even know why they brought them in. But, there's actually nothing wrong with those rights as long as you're like, I'll say what I want and you can say what you want, right? But if you had a country where you could say absolutely what you wanted with complete freedom, which is what it kind of makes out, then the other person you wouldn't actually have any laws, because no one would be breaking the law when they spoke or said anything. And no one would be breaking the law when they expressed themselves in whatever way. On Father Ted, drink feck, if there's a drink feck or whatever, right? And people, these companies wouldn't be able to, know all these things, it would be complete privacy. And they wouldn't be gathering assessment data on us and evaluating us and using that information to make plans and strategies on how they want to further make controls and get us to submit and consent and accept, how to be blocked or banned or removed or whatever, or, they're studying us. They are studying us as study subjects. And if you have a right to privacy, they don't have a right to do that, right? And you've got to submit and consent and accept all of the policies basically now. So there isn't an option because you can't actually use the platforms. It's not possible to use the platforms, So it needs to be argued on that human rights article on the convention. But no one is arguing it, because you don't get into a situation where you argue it. Most people are enjoying being on the platforms and like them. They don't see how it fits in with the overall strategy to it. And the actual tool itself, the only way to kind of fight this and combat it really now is to actually use it. And to use it, you've got to consent and accept. So collecting signatures to try and get the government not to do it, you've got to use these tools and consent and accept. That can't be constitutionally right either, So the way that it's all been done is completely and totally wrong, against human rights convention. And, unfortunately, we just cannot get access to the right legal people. I don't even know if there are any legal people who want to take it on, because most of them kind of support a lot of these things. You would think that someone like Black Belt Barrister, who is into art and media law, but he doesn't seem to be... They never seem to do any YouTube cases, mainly because the issues are mainly around constitutional law and political law and rights, or election law and rights on these platforms. But I think it's against human rights articles. But like Black Belt Barrister and Alan from that Coach House Chambers, they're not human rights lawyers. So they're not professional human rights lawyers, but Starmer is. And this is the thing, you really need... I don't actually know if there are any human rights lawyers who are also digital media lawyers, who are lawyers who actually do art and media, or the other things like surveillance, police surveillance and processes, because there's a convergence of different fields of law here as well.